By now, hopefully you've had the chance to check out the brand new Mervyn Warren Choir from veteran sample makers Spitfire Audio. There are so many choral libraries on the market already, but I've always considered choral sampling to be a bit of a holy grail. It is one of the most difficult things in the world to sample realistically, even harder than an orchestra. Because even after you've accounted for the hiring of the best talent, and the studio, and the engineer, and you've planned out the sampling session, which are excruciating by the way, because it's many, many hours of single notes, you have to achieve pinpoint precision, and then with a choir, you've got to multiply it by multiple vowels, potentially consonants, phrases, anything else you want to sample to make this thing sound real. It is a really complicated thing to do. Now, earlier on my channel, I actually did a video comparing 19 sampled choirs against each other. And in that video, there's a very wide gamut of styles represented. So I do feel justified in saying, this one is different. This one celebrates the richness of the black choral tradition, and it was meticulously conceived of and executed by 5-time Grammy winner Mervyn Warren. You may know him as one of the founding members of the vocal group Take 6, and then through the years, Merv has been highly sought after as a producer and arranger for people like Whitney Houston, Barbra Streisand, Quincy Jones, and he's known for his film scoring work too, on films like A Walk to Remember, Wedding Planner, Sister Act 2, Preacher's Wife, many others. Merv is a legend in this industry, and he's really the perfect, one of the only people who could ever pull this off. So I was fortunate enough to be a part of this project. I was the conductor on the sessions that were held at Evergreen Studios here in Los Angeles, California. And over the course of a week, we recorded some of the finest voices in the world in excruciating detail. Now, when I first started talking to Merv about this project, I made the assumption, well, it's probably just going to be a gospel choir library, right? And he stopped me and said, no, it can be that, but what I really want to do is celebrate the richness of the black choral tradition. Now, previous to this project, I've been an owner and a fan of Eric Whitacre's choir library, which also comes from Spitfire Audio. It's a gorgeous choir, but it very much sits at the opposite end of the spectrum compared to Merv's choir. While Eric's library is more pure and straight-toned and more in the British choral tradition, Merv's represents a more traditional American sound with richer, fuller tones. I do love both these libraries. I'll continue to use them in my own scores, but I wanted to highlight the contrast between the two. They're very different. As we were putting together this library, and as Spitfire embedded it into their new Spitfire Ensemble player, I got a chance to play with it some. As a challenge, I really wanted to put it through its paces and see what I could make it do. So I wrote an entire piece of music using nothing but the Mervyn Warren Choir. That demo is up on the Spitfire site, but in this video, I wanted to give you a peek behind the scenes of how it was made and show you some of the granular detail that's available in the library. And in doing so, I'll also get to show you some production techniques that I used to polish it and make it sound like what I wanted it to sound like. So let me start by playing the whole demo for you, and then after that, I'll start to break it down into some of its component parts. As I said, everything you hear in this video is made by the Mervyn Warren Choir. So, as you can see in my sequence, I like color coding things because that helps me separate the families of what I'm working on. So let's start with my blue and green tracks right in the middle because they form the guts of where this piece started. They're made up of patches like these, the tenor and bass longs, coupled with the soprano and alto longs. As you can see in the interface, we're given 5 choices of sustains: ahs, ums, ohs, oohs, and yeahs. So in this section, I used a little bit of the oohs, a little bit of the ohs to create contrasts, and then I stacked a little extra bass there because I wanted individual control over the bass. So here's what just that stem of voices sounds like by itself. Now I mentioned I put the basses on a track by themselves. There's a reason for that. There's another group of patches called stacked longs, and this is where Spitfire programmed the library to layer multiple vowels over each other so you get a much bigger and wider sound. So if I solo just this track, this is what you hear. Now, the beauty of having that on a fader by itself means I can have total control over all that bassy girth, and I can control how much of that I need in my sound relative to all the rest of the voices, which largely self-balance themselves. The next section of the piece features some aleatoric sounds highlighted in medium blue here. And the thing about these aleatoric patches is that they introduce a degree of randomness to the sound. The patch you're seeing here with the sopranos and altos is offered in two variants, O's and U's. It was recorded by having the choir start on that vowel and then start to morph and diverge into adjacent vowels and crescendos and diminuendos, and it resulted in all kinds of random textures and percolations. It basically creates more of a living, pulsating texture. And this can be really effective for more ambient types of music or any time where you want the pad to not just sit there, but to actually evolve over time. So here's what those tracks sound like soloed. You'll notice they sound very clustery and almost Eric Whitacre, but in a very different tonal sense. Now, by themselves, I didn't feel like this section had enough going on layer-wise, so I decided to start experimenting with some shorter staccato articulations. These little bubbly patches, which is what I call them informally, just to remember what they were as I was building. They don't really sound like a traditional live choir would sound. You wouldn't write a choir to sing in this style, but once you combine them with some of the aleatoric stuff I played a minute ago, and then you add some stomps and claps, you get this. So now I've got three different families of sounds going on at the same time in this section, which is really what I was going for. I wanted something to contrast with the section that came before it. And then, as soon as I finished this section, I thought to myself, well, what can I do now? Let's pivot again. Let's try something different. Let's go back to a traditional choral style, and let's showcase the legatos, because the legatos in this library are absolutely amazing. They were sampled up to an octave in both directions, and in my opinion, this is where the realism really shines through. So I pivoted back to these light blue tracks that I call my unfolding chords, and I used the legato patches for this, both soprano, alto, and tenor bass separately. I actually wrote 6 different parts, put them all on the O vowel, knowing I was going to use the mod wheel to open up the dynamic from quiet to loud over the phrase. Here's what it sounds like. And if you're curious to hear it even more broken down, here's just the soprano 1 part so you can really hear that legato coming out. As you can see in my MIDI editor here, those yellow dots are my mod wheel opening up over time. Listen to this. That right there is one of my favorite parts of the library, its ability to be dynamically expressive. And you can see that I didn't even bother to quantize the notes. I really wanted them to sing freely and not be constrained to a grid. If I had quantized this, it probably would have sucked all of the natural timing out of this piece. So now let's move to the final section, where I use these yellow humming tracks and my green O's for the finale, adding just a little bit of extra bass for this foundation. I'm going to play you just that last chord there. So at the top of the range, you've got the sopranos humming in that almost impossibly high register. But these singers, they were superhuman, I'll tell you that. They sang every note with infinite patience and control and precision. And I think the results are just magical. Let me actually break down this section a little bit more because it took me by surprise as I played that individual stem. Here's the humming alone. Now that was a beautiful cluster of a chord, but let me solo my other group, the green tracks, because they're doing this stair-stepping additional harmony line. Check this out. And if you have eagle ears, you might realize that I did something a little bit extra here. Even though the library includes what we call mega bass, these amazing bass singers that can go all the way down to the bottom of the stave and beyond, I decided to go even a step further than that. So I had them sing that low E flat, which is in the library, and then I put this third-party plugin, Soundtoy's Little Altar Boy, to take it down an octave below that, to give it even more extra supernatural richness. Here's the mega, mega, mega super low bass. So there's a little secret tip about scoring. When we're working on music in the computer, we don't necessarily have to be bound by the realities of what the instruments can do in real life. Sometimes we do things just because they sound good. So the next thing I want to show you, it's a really small thing, but it's a crucial detail to realism. A real choir needs to breathe, right? Before every note or phrase they sing, there's got to be an inhale of air before the notes can come out. So since this piece is structured more or less like a real choir piece, I decided to add those breaths in there because I wanted you to be able to feel that air moving. So these are the breaths that occur the beat before each new phrase starts. They're very subtle, they're minimal, but they're enough to give you the sense that the ensemble is truly breathing before they sing a note. And sure enough, when we were in the studio, that's exactly what we asked the singers to do. We asked them to take an inhaling breath as if they were getting ready to sing a note right after it. We want to hear and feel that air move into your lungs, that air that powers the note that is about to come. So now when I play back this breath track, followed by the notes, it should make total aural sense. The library also contains a section of long whispers as well as breaths. There's combined whispers, there's chatter, there's dark airy breaths, there's bright airy breaths. So after the final chord of the piece, I decided to stick just a little bit of that in there just to make you feel like you were in the room with them. It's really subtle, but I was determined to try and find every nook and cranny of this library and find a use for it. So let's talk about the mix. Normally, I mix as I go when I'm working on a piece like this, and I self-balance things as I add new elements. But now, once all the music is there, it's time to massage those elements and really kind of polish them to get them until they're presentable and smooth and coherent together. I chose to submix the entire choir minus the percussion to a bus of its own so I could really control the choir sound. And by doing that, it was very easy to also send the entire choir to a reverb to add a little bit of additional space over the ensemble. So here I'm using FabFilter's Pro R2 with a Bright Hall preset. I did roll off the lows a bit. That's a little trick of mine. I never want the reverb to make the sound muddier, so I'll always roll off some of those lows to make sure things aren't accumulating down there. And at the bottom of the sequence are my red tracks. Red for me is always my percussion and drums. I sent those to a different reverb because I found that the first reverb I was using was a little too big and creating too much mud when the percussive stuff was happening. So over the percussion, I used a different instance of Pro R2 just to make sure it was a little bit cleaner and wasn't interfering with the main choir. I also wanted the ability to decide just how much ambience the percussion needed. And as far as the master chain for this project, I kept it pretty simple. I'm using a PSP VintageWarmer 2, a classic plugin that gives me some very nice saturation and compression. It can give me some additional richness and also sparkle in the highs if I want it, and a little bit of grit too, a little bit of analog grit. I added just a hair of that. Then I pass it off to the FabFilter Pro L2 limiter, which really isn't doing anything except catching a few stray peaks that go over the threshold. But all of the heavy lifting of the final bus compression is really being done by the VintageWarmer. And if you're curious to hear it with and without the VintageWarmer, that's a really interesting sonic experiment. Let me play it for you, and I'll switch the VintageWarmer on and off so you can hear the before and after difference. For me, the VintageWarmer always brings out the life in the music, and it also brings it a step closer to you in proximity. I love that effect. So there it is, my demo for the Mervyn Warren Choir from Spitfire Audio. I'm tremendously honored to have been a part of its creation, and I give huge thanks to Merv and the Spitfire team for having me along for the ride. I've already put this library to use in a film score I was working on just last week. I didn't go anywhere near this level of complexity with that, but I just used it to thicken up some choral pads and to provide some extra richness to the orchestra. And since it was such a textural score, it worked perfectly for that. I'll probably explore some of that in a future video at another time. So, Whether you're a fan of vocal or choral music, or you're writing for film and TV or trailers, I think this library will find a special place in the portfolio of every composer. And I hope you enjoyed a peek behind the curtain of this particular demo. I look forward to hearing the music that you might make with this library, because this is really a library that could be used in 100 different ways. So if you do come up with something cool, please post it in the comments. I'd love to hear it. So until next time, stay creative. I'll see you on the next one.